So I'd like to welcome to the stage the filmmakers of Armor of Light. So this is the director of Armor of Light, Abigail Disney. And Abigail, do you want to introduce the three subjects?
This is Rob Schenck, Reverend Rob Schenck, who is the minister at the center of our film that we follow. And this is Lucy McBath, who has become an incredibly articulate voice. And this is John Phillips, who is an attorney that we began following him even before we met Lucy, who led us to Lucy and has been a great voice in the film.
So we started talking a little bit about this backstage, and you just mentioned it right now that you started this journey with John. So could you go into that? Because these three stories start kind of separately, and then they sort of weave together, and they also weave back in time as well through history, which is really beautiful. So
right. Yeah, we kind of came to Lucy a little bit backwards, but just because the originating concept behind the film was that I was raised in a very, very conservative household. And, as I look now at the language around guns and gun use, the values that I'm hearing don't strike me as conservative values as I was taught them when I was young. So I was looking really for conservatives who'd be willing to kind of take that out for a drive with me. What does it mean when I say that these are not what are recognizable to me as conservative values? So one of the people I went looking for was somebody who had been a conservative, who was a gun owner, who was willing to kind of maybe talk a little bit about maybe how things were straying from conservative principles. We were looking for apostates and heretics. And so we found John, who at the time was an attorney, was sort of helping represent a family who had lost their son in a stand your ground case. He had been a gun owner and a big Second Amendment supporter until he met this family. And it was through John that we met Lucy. And as we were getting to know Rob and understanding, Rob's sensibilities and language and thinking around the whole issue, and as we got to know Lucy better, we realized really Rob and Lucy needed to know each other because there was an incredibly powerful consonance in the way they thought about issues.
Mm-hmm. So you really were the one that brought them together.
Yeah, we brought Rob and Lucy together, a naughty thing that you're not supposed to do in documentary filmmaking, but honestly, for me, as I'm sometimes I can't hold the activists back, and there was something that really important that was going to have to happen there, and Rob and Lucy meeting each other, and just there's something very powerful in the way that their visions blended together. We just couldn't resist putting them together.
Mm-hmm. One of the most salient points for me, and I would hope everyone else as well, was something that you said, Rob. It was along the lines of good people can come together and contribute to bad outcomes. And I wanted you to get into that a little because it really speaks to something. It's a difficult thing for people to accept. So could you talk a little bit about that and how that philosophy influences the way you talk to people about the issue?
Sure. Well, first, as a pastor, I care for souls, and part of my responsibility is shaping and forming the way people approach their Christian faith. And I think a healthy way to do that is with a measure of self-doubt about yourself. And I've been on both sides. I've been on, and I talk about in the Armor of Light, I talk about easy answers and simplistic answers and how they can be like, I compare it to heroin because it can become very addictive. It's a very fast way to resolve immediate pain, but in the long term, it only complicates things further. And in this situation, when you're sure that everything you do will always come out right and come out good, and simply because you may have good intentions, the outcome will always be good, is something that doesn't prove to be reality in people's lives. So you can get a lot of good people together, and I know a lot of good people who are members of the NRA. They are good people. They're good family people. They're engaged in their communities. Some of them are quite generous philanthropists. But when they come together around a certain cause, it takes on kind of a life and a momentum of its own that may, and I think in this case, ends up in a very dark and damaging place. So that's, I work with that throughout the conversation in the film.
And then another thing that you also sort of observed, I noticed, was the fact that in certain pockets of the evangelical community, spiritualism and guns sort of go hand in hand, and that was just a very fleeting observation. I mean, it's unpackaged a lot throughout the film, but I wonder if you could go a little bit more into that for those who haven't seen the film and are interested.
Well, Abby did a very good job taming my theological gobbledygook, because I tend to speak in an idiosyncratic kind of language that's peculiar to our community of evangelical Christians. And evangelical Christians are very big supporters of Second Amendment gun rights. A lot of them, a very significant proportion of them, are members of the NRA. And, it's kind of gotten woven into a sort of spiritual commitment to the Second Amendment, that somehow the Constitution and the Bible, which for evangelicals, the Bible is the standard for belief and practice. So when you start confusing the two documents, you can also confuse your religious principles from your civic principles. And I want to decouple those two things. So I've done that in some of my conversations with pastors, with church leaders, to get them to see those two things as opposites. I don't know if it was in the clip, but in one case, I make the case in supporting the Second Amendment, we have to be careful not to violate the Second Commandment, which is a hint that our obsession with guns can actually become a form of spiritual heresy or religious idolatry, which in our community is a grave spiritual error.
It's become thou shalt not kill unless you have a subjective fear. And that's a problem.
That's a very significant problem, and it certainly violates another tenet, which is to treat others as we would want ourselves treated, the golden rule, which came from the lips of Christ, and loving our neighbor as ourselves, which is the second of the greatest commandments. So all of these have spiritual implications, serious ones.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly. So throughout the film, for those who haven't seen it yet, Rob has not only, goes through his own sort of like understanding of his relationship to the issue of gun violence and, the Second Amendment, and he also gets into conversations with other members of the evangelical pastoral community. So let's take a look at a clip that sort of demonstrates one of these conversations. So for a little context, that was a meeting with your executive board for the pastor organization that you sort of oversee, right? So how did you get access to that?
Well, we got access because Rob was kind enough to take the risk, really, of convincing people that we could be trusted, which was a task, I can be Googled. And I didn't try to misrepresent myself to anyone. I was always pretty straightforward about my politics being radically different from theirs. But generally speaking, when we would walk in there and I would say, look, I really want to understand this. I'm here to understand this. I don't disrespect you. I don't think people disagree with me because they're bad people or because they're stupid people. I know that you have genuine, well-developed opinions, and I need to understand them. And when I approach people that way, they tended to be very unguarded and willing to go ahead and have the conversation. And it wound up being an incredibly fascinating series of conversations that we heard.
Indeed.
And that was certainly because Abby is very sincere. That's authentically her. So that trust is established almost immediately, and others sensed it too, and that's why they let you in that room when they wouldn't have let any other film crew in there.
And you can also sense that even after, the film has gone through the editing process, and that's how I watched it. And it's really amazing how sort of it just is very neutral and just sort of presents the information. And do you think that that's as a result of the editing process as well? Because it's very easy, editing is about constructing an argument in a lot of cases. So I'm curious how you kind of balance those interests.
Well, you can construct an argument, you can tell a story, you can paint a picture, you can do a lot of things when you edit. And Kathy Hughes, who's my co-director, is here, and our director, Andy Fredericks, and I think we all of us at one time or another had got a moment of like, and I wanted to argue with somebody, or I wanted to undercut somebody, or, because you have your opinions. But we really went into it with a very strong commitment to respect the ethos and the humanity and the dignity of every person in it, and a willingness not to undercut anybody, and just to let people speak for themselves and let what they say stand on its own merits or not. And so it took a lot of restraint on all our parts, and I think the three of us kind of had a constant dance of keeping each other honest. And so that was like a constant give and take in the edit room. There were definitely hard moments. It really took a lot of control on our part not to assert our own point of view.
Yeah, and Lucy, I know that towards the beginning of the film, when we first meet you, there was a struggle for you in terms of, do you make this your life, activism, or, do you not? At what point, did you decide to do it? And then also, how did the film sort of, was that after you had met Abby or before? Or could you share a little insight to that?
For me, it was just a slow evolving, but I think I knew very early on, I was really getting a good sense from God that Jordan's murder happened for a reason, because it happened so quickly right after Trayvon. And then we had Sandy Hook. And then we've had all these, considerable massacres. And I just began to see Jordan's death as a part of the larger picture. And that I was beginning to feel very unsettled at work. And I was beginning to recognize that God was giving me more opportunity to stand and speak out about the gun violence, and using Jordan and our story as a means to catapult, to people. We're victims. This is happening progressively more and more often. And so I think that as I became a little bit more uneasy just speaking out about it, it really began to feel to me that, okay, you just can't speak out about this anymore. You've got to move. There has to be some action behind it, because there's so many people that I've been meeting, particularly parents, survivors all the time, that they're all crying out, this is happening. What can you do about it? How can you help us? Because I'd been given a voice, a national platform, and it was just becoming increasingly evident to me that God was showing me. And he had specifically said to me, my people must see my face. You must show them who I am. They must turn their faces back to me. And of course, I could never understand or realize what I would be expected to do or how I would be involved in this movement to do that. But I just began to understand that I had to be obedient, and that this would be Jordan's legacy, but not just his legacy, but all the other children and family members across the country who've died even before Jordan and have died senselessly over gun violence in this country, that I would have to move. I would have to act and not just talk about it.
Mm-hmm. And could you talk a little bit about your father, I believe, who was the president of the NAACP chapter in Illinois, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, and how that had sort of had an influence, like, on your thought process as you were going through all of this?
Right. As children, I remember very distinctly, we would always be in the back seat of my father's car, and as Daddy was speaking at rallies or marching with Martin Luther King or Roy Wilkins, we were put in the back seat of the car. We had our pillows and our blankets and potato chips and coloring books, and we would go right along. We didn't understand what Daddy was doing at that time. We didn't understand how profoundly that would impact us. But and I remember, the nights where all the cocktail parties, where all the civil rights activists were at my house. And I remember peeking through the door, going, ooh, all these people that are here, why are they here? But I think, all those images, everything that I experienced as a child has resonated so deeply in me becoming the activist, because my father was a civil rights activist. And my father really believed in preserving people's human and civil rights. And I think that is just instinctively who I've become. It's so funny because when I look in the mirror, I look at my father and I say, now I really understand your need to give your life for other people.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about what sort of work you're doing right now at this moment? What sort of initiatives or campaigns that you have in the works?
I've kind of evolved into this accidental activist, so to speak, but I've now taken a role as national spokesperson with Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America, and I'm also the faith and community outreach organizer for Every Town for Gun Safety. And we are the largest nonpartisan grassroots gun violence prevention organization in the country. And we are NRA members, we are gun owners, we are law enforcement, we are doctors, we are mothers. We come from every bit of the population, individuals who've come together recognizing that we have to stem the tide of gun violence, that no one is immune to it anymore. And what we do is we educate you and we give you the tools to begin the process of helping to create the change. We talk to legislators, we talk to civic groups, we talk to educators, and what we want to do is just bring to light what's happening in the country and just urge people to begin the movement of gun violence prevention in this country.
So let's take a look at a second clip, actually, where Lucy kind of provides a little bit of analysis on the NRA and sort of the philosophy that they have. So this is a question to all of you, and this idea of, this very real idea of being sort of taken over by fear and allowing fear to lead you to violence. I'm curious what your thoughts are on each individual person sort of being able to do their part in overcoming that, whether they own a gun or they don't own a gun. I'm just curious what you think.
I mean, I think that this is a far bigger issue than guns. This is a very, perhaps not a uniquely American problem, but Americans have, in the last 15 years, brought a stunning amount of energy to the idea of safety, that there is such a thing as safety, and we have brought an enormous amount of energy and money to bear on the idea that we can make ourselves invulnerable in our little corner to almost any threat. And so, I mean, it's my personal belief, and I think, probably Rumi and Buddha and a lot of other people would support me in this, that the harder you try to grasp at something, the more it slips away from you. So since September 11th, more American adults have been killed by toddlers than by terrorists, for instance. because of the proliferation of small arms and the failure of people to keep them responsibly in their homes. So we have a double-edged problem. One is that there's a terrible spiritual poverty in a perpetual defensive crouch that needs to be addressed. It is a deep spiritual and psychic problem that's at the heart not only of each individual American, but then at all of us as a society we need to address. And second of all, as we do everything that seems to be right at our fingertips to do to make ourselves safer, each and every one of those things tends to bring us closer into contact with the very dangers we're trying to push away. So we have an enormous obligation to have a dialogue as a country about how much safety is enough and how much do you undermine what it is you're trying to get by grasping at safety and safety alone.
I would add from my perspective in the film, when Abby invited me to be a part of this marvelous project, the reason I said yes, I would become a part of the Armor of Light, cooperate with her project, was because it's an invitation for people to join a conversation and a spiritual exercise of their own. And that's why I like the approach that Abby took in the film, is that all sides are respected equally. No one is dismissed with contempt. Everyone is invited to be a part of a process. And for me as a pastor, I see that as a spiritual process, as a spiritual exercise. And it's deeply internal. So for me, it's not a legislative process. It might be for others, but not for me. For me, it's spiritual formation. It's what's happening deep inside the soul and conscience of the individual. And they can come to their own conclusions and then bring that to the other aspects of the discussion.
Mm-hmm. And Lucy, do you have anything to add in terms of what you think? I mean, you're very open about your spiritual journey and sort of, overcoming fear and stuff like that. So how, someone like myself or anyone else, like no matter what, creed or we prescribe to, how we might sort of live that out in our day-to-day lives.
I think you have to decide for yourself, how deeply do you believe in your faith? How deeply are you committed to walking out your faith? Because so many times as Christians, we say, oh, we know God, we believe in God, but there's a lot more to really living a life intimately with God every day. And I think once you have come to that understanding and that you know God that way for yourself, then it makes it a little bit easier to be able to walk out your faith, because it becomes just who you are. And, I meet people all the time that say, oh yeah, I love God, I know God. But it's a whole different realm of existing with God daily when you're really trying to love, accept, and forgive others. It's a whole different realm. And when you learn to love God that way, it propels you to do things you never thought you would do before, to stand up for issues and ideas and people, because it becomes really who you are, loving and accepting and forgiving and really caring, as Reverend Schenck says, about your fellow man. And becomes real.
There's certainly, to go to Reverend Schenck's point, which is my area, the legislative and the judicial side too. I mean, I invite anybody in the audience to raise your hand if you think you're closed-minded. Nobody's ever going to say that they're okay, and it's rare. It's rare that somebody, bless your heart, that would admit that they're truly closed-minded. And it's within that closed-mindedness that fear exists. And it's within Lucy and Ron and really Jordan opening my mind. I mean, literally lifting my skull over and saying, here, walk with us for 3 years. Like, see what we see prejudice in restaurants, and understanding, I give these talks and was invited to talk to the NAACP through this, and it's been amazing. But there's one way that I explain to people that kind of have my upbringing of the difference between what we're dealing with white America and black America, and it's in the talk. And when I say the talk to the white parent, they know what I mean. They mean the birds and the bees. That's the fundamental talk that gives us the butterflies in our stomach. But when the sister gives the talk to her son, and we now see it and we know about it a little more, but it's about survival. It's about how that young boy, Jordan Davis, Trayvon Martin, isn't going to get the benefit of the doubt. They're born without that benefit of the doubt. And we went through 2 trials because of that. And that's where fear lives, and that's where fear and God, while they can coexist, they can't coexist in a nation with 350 million guns.
So you guys eventually prevailed with the conviction after 2 appeals, 3 appeals?
2 trials.
2 trials. So what are the next steps in terms of like legislation and that sort of, because I know you are still very much, John, like a part of this whole thing and the work that you're doing as well. So could you walk us through that?
Certainly. Somebody came up to me last night and asked if we could just have Stand Your Ground repealed. And I said, boy, that would make this all easier. And it's not that. It's, with what we're doing, with what my firm's doing, is we're trying to give it a death by 1,000 cuts. Appellate law, trial court law, really attacking it by just taking exceptions out of it and letting people know that a subjective license to kill isn't a proper license to kill by man's standard or by religious standards, any of them. And so that's kind of where we've taken on cases that frankly require hundreds of hours for work without any payday at the end, and they're just it's you got to do it for the passion of wanting a better life for your children and your children's children. And Lucy, from her advocacy stake, she can touch, and certainly Reverend Schenck. That's where the low stakes poker that I get to play is amazing. That Abby brings some poker players. Not to put you in a gambling analogy, but some
we don't do
players
poker, but
that really can get a conversation started, more than in a trial court in Duval County, Florida.
And Rob, could you speak a little bit more about the conversations, because you've been really active in speaking within your community of like religious leaders, as well as like politicians and such, and pro-life activists. Like what sort of conversations have happened after the ones that we've seen in the film?
Yeah, well, one of the parts of that is that I often assure confidence. Some people aren't willing yet to talk publicly. But I've had plenty of pastors whisper to me, I'm very much with you in this. I can't say it publicly right now. Some of them fear it will divide their congregations. Others fear that it will end their careers as pastors, as church leaders. Others aren't quite sure. They don't have the tools yet to engage their own congregants, the people under their charges, but we hope to give them those tools, partly through the Armor of Light. We want it screened in churches all across America. And we're hoping pastors and church leaders, both at the local church level and in national associations, will screen the film, because so far the response has been very positive on both sides of the issue. And I think we approach it right. I have great confidence that we do. And we give people the safe space. Abby started that in her first conversation with me. She gave me safe space to talk about who I really am and how I really feel. And she did that with a great deal of respect. And I thank you for that, Abby, because that set the tone for the whole film. And now we hope to take that same tone of respect and listening and safe space for people to start exploring this on their own. And I think once they do, they will encounter some beautiful surprises, even in their own hearts and souls.
Yeah, definitely. So we are going to move to question and answers with the audience. There are two people who will come around with microphones.
Hi, thank you so much for this project. I haven't seen it yet, but it's wonderful. And this question is to really anyone on the panel. I appreciate that it's not just a legislative battle, that there's other levels that you're fighting. And I recently have spent the last 6 months teaching high school English on Rikers Island, and it's given me a chance, all with adolescent males. And I've been shocked at how much their connection with guns is so strong, and they want to get out and get more guns, and they've shot, and it doesn't seem like they're really shooting someone. And I don't know where that epidemic has come from, and there's this detachment from real life, and I don't know if there's anything in your film or any movement that might help that. I know some of my students have talked about, well, it's the music that we listen to, but it's on the streets and they grow up with that as being normal.
You know, there are a lot of people pointing at a lot of different things to explain this, and there is no single answer to your question, and therefore no single way to address the problem. But one of the reasons I had to make this film was because I keep looking at my country, and I, for instance, when we're presented with the idea of going into a war, the media pivots toward this language, which sort of relishes the idea of what we're going to do and who we're going to destroy, and there's just this kind of unmistakable lust and pleasure in it, and there's a deep problematic there, and you know, I'm just a tiny little person, and I'm going to do everything in my power, honestly, to just assert that peace is better than violence, that love is better than hate, and no matter how attractive the hate and the violence and the blood may be made to look in lots of different kinds of places, but most especially our media, that we all, those of us who think differently, need to assert something better and ask people to rise to their higher selves. And I don't care how degraded a person may seem, there's something in there that can be reawakened. I really do believe that.
And may I commend you for your
Yes.
great work teaching at Rikers Island. That's wonderful. And a point you'll hear me make in the film is when there is a void in the conversation, when the people who ought to be speaking are not speaking, other voices will fill that void. And in this case, they are harmful and damaging and destructive voices. So let's fill that empty space with goodness and good words and good ideas and respect for humanity, and give people that kind of hero image to look to, and crowd out the other voices and the other images. Thank you for doing that.
It's fascinating to see you all come back to the same word or idea, language. It's the choice of words. For example, you describe gun violence prevention as opposed to gun control or gun regulation. Or you have the guy from the NRA saying that, do you really believe they can protect us? Well, we see a guy who's not even a real policeman, a volunteer, 73 years old, accidentally shoots someone with a gun instead of a taser, and it's all about who, you know, how the language is posed. So and you talk about the conversation, changing the conversation. It's how to change the language. And does this, not having seen the film yet, but I assume that the large part of the film is shifting the language of the conversation from one way we view it to another way we view it, and getting people to say the other phrase. I mean, you talk about right to life or being pro-life. Well, you know, the argument is, and often the pro-life factions call it they call it, the anti-abortion they call them, anti-life as opposed to being anti-abortion. So I want to hear about what efforts are being made to change the language.
Well, definitely I can say in my work, we have found very easily in talking with individuals all across the country, organizations, that the verbiage that puts everyone up in arms and gets them to fear is control. And you will hear NRA members again and again and again say they want to control us, they want to take our guns away, they want to control our households. So, and I think there's a reason why the NRA does that, because it continues to fuel that fear and kind of devalues what people really need to be thinking about. So verbiage is, the terms that you use, the wording that you use is very, very, very important, because what you have to do is disarm people. Specifically when you're dealing with gun violence and you're talking to individuals about, the need to change the laws, to amend the laws, to protect people, we have found that you have to be very, very specific in getting them to be disarmed so they themselves are not thinking and believing that you're out to get them. And I think that's what we're all having to do across the board. We're really trying to disarm people to open up enough to have conversation about what's happening with the gun culture, what's happening with the laws, and how really each of us is really individually responsible at whatever way to be concerned about the welfare of others. So it's having to balance and walk a fine line, because what you're really trying to make sure is that people's Second Amendment rights are not infringed upon. That's important. But at the same time, making sure that people are accountable for the ways in which they use their guns. And so it's, once again, a symbiotic relationship that both sides, gun owners, people who want guns, and people who want to keep you safe in using the guns, we all have to come to that same common ground and use kind of the same verbiage.
And many times these words have been focus grouped, okay? The NRA knows what they were doing. ALEC knew what they were doing when we did Stand Your Ground. Barack Obama voted for Stand Your Ground. And it was couched in fear, and it was couched in that example of maybe there's a 0.0001, although they didn't tell you that, chance that your grandmother gets assaulted, or the college co-ed example, or the looting example, which is what got it in Florida. Looters come, you got to be able to defend yourself. Well, that's not Stand Your Ground, that's castle doctrine. That's been there forever. And so the language of us versus them is what you're talking about, and that's the problem. Is we've got to find a mutual language to disarm figuratively and potentially literally, more so, to be able to speak the same language, because when we're dealing with the political word choice, we're not going to make any movement whatsoever.
Of course, as a minister, I've been given a few assets in that, because the language of the Sermon on the Mount is so magnificent and so powerful. Blessed are the peacemakers. Let's start there. Love not only your neighbor, but love your enemy. Jesus said to the disciples when they were in fear for their life, "Fear not, it is I." So I have a little bit of an advantage, and so maybe I get to shortcut it a little bit, but I'm just preaching more Bible these days and helping evangelicals to come back to what they really, truly believe. We don't follow bumper sticker slogans. We follow profound and ancient words that have powerfully shaped people and communities for millennia. And that's where we need to get back to and away from popular slogans.
Yeah, and that's exactly. There's a very big difference between the kind of language that Stand Your Ground is, and that's like a political stick of dynamite. It's calculated to invigorate the conflict. And we're stuck in a broken political dynamic. We have a badly broken political dynamic. And everybody's impulse when they get angry is just to push harder against the other side, which only makes the other side push harder. Nothing will get us out of this dynamic except something wildly different. So we need to get back to actual language, not political language, this kind of lobbing of hand grenades that takes place as a substitute for actual conversation, which is why we keep coming back to this language about the film being an invitation to a conversation or a dialogue or a discourse of some kind of honest conversation about what our values are. Because as long as those sticks of dynamites are there between us, we don't have any idea what we share. It took Rob and me 5 minutes to figure out that we had so much more in common in terms of our values than not, coming from the opposite end of the political spectrum. I think there are a lot of people invested in us not finding that out about each other. It would be maybe the single most radical thing on earth for right and left to sit down together and discover we're not all that far apart.
Amazing. Well, let's thank Abby, Rob, Lucy, and John for coming out today. And thank you as well. And you can check out Armor of Light during the Tribeca Film Festival.
It's playing again Tuesday night and Saturday night. Please come.
Awesome. Thank you.